Hi everyone and welcome to the Arkham Seeker. Today in this video I'll tell you my first thoughts after having played the campaign The Feast of Hemlock Vale for the first time. Here you can see the structure of this video, which of course will not contain any spoilers of the story. First I'll explain the general characteristics of the campaign for those who still don't know, both on a theme and a mechanical level. Then I'm going to give my subjective opinion of the campaign, separating those aspects that I liked from those that I disliked. Finally, I'll compare and weigh the good and bad aspects of the campaign and give you my general first thoughts after my blind playthrough. So let's start explaining the general characteristics of this Hemlock Vale campaign. In this campaign, the investigators are sent to the Isle of Hemlock Vale in a survey organized by the Miskatonic University. This survey is led by botanist Dr. Rosa Marquez and is motivated by her analysis of several samples of flora from the isle that made her think that there may be something that is being developed at a flora level and that can be potentially dangerous for the isle or maybe for something more. For this reason, the university approves this expedition where, through our usual contact, Dr. Armitage, the investigators will be sent with this expedition as a reinforcement. Once the group reaches the Isle of Hemlock Vale, they will have 3 days and 3 nights to find out and stop whatever is happening in the isle. The campaign has exactly 6 game sessions, which will be these 3 days and 3 nights, where you will have to investigate several areas of the isle. Meanwhile, the isle's residents who have not received visits for a long time, as Hemlock Vale is a private isle, will be organizing a feast, where for the first time in many years they will open the isle for visits. The neighbors will be preparing this feast, apparently unaware of the threat that may be closing on them. In particular, 8 of these residents will be characters who the investigators can interact with. In fact, these 8 characters will have their own page in the campaign log, where the players must record their relationship level with each of them, as well as making specific notes for each. Whenever the investigators interact with one of these characters, the game may ask them to increase or decrease their relationship level. In the case that the relationship level with a character is high enough, he or she may help the investigators at certain points in the story, or even the opposite. If a relationship level is too low, that character may turn against the investigator at some points in the story. The Feast of Hemlock Vale is a non-linear campaign, like the Scarlet Keys, in the sense that the scenarios are not always played in the same order. In particular, each scenario is an area of the isle that the players can investigate, and on each day and each night, the players must decide which area of the isle they are going to investigate, that is to say, which scenario to play. Besides, each scenario can change depending on when it's played, depending on if it's played earlier or later in the story. However, the most significant changes come depending on if the scenario is played on day or night. There will be several encounter cards with different texts that are only active in the day and other that are only active in the night. Here you have a small example at the bottom right of the image of an enemy that has different abilities depending on whether it's day or night. As I've been saying, Hemlock Vale is a non-linear campaign where players decide which scenario to play in each session. However, at the beginning of each day and each night, a prelude takes place, which is a narrative segment where most of the story is developed. And sometimes the preludes include a brief playable section, which is a small scenario that only lasts 3 or 4 rounds and where the investigators can move through the Hemlock Village, visit its different zones, and interact with the neighbors, being able to increase their relationship level with some of them. Besides, the preludes are an opportunity for the investigators to prepare themselves for the next scenario. At the end of each playable prelude, each investigator can keep an asset in his or her play area and as many cards and resources as they have at the end of the prelude, limited by their starting number, which is generally 5 in both cases. As I'm saying, the preludes have 3 main functions: tell the story in a coherent way, allow the players to interact with the residents, and also allow them to prepare themselves for the next scenario. I think that this sums up well the main characteristics of the campaign, at least those I can tell without spoiling the story. So let's move into the more subjective part of the video, where I'm going to tell you my personal opinion after having played the campaign for the first time, and I'll do it by separating the aspects that I liked from the aspects that I didn't like. Let's start with the positive aspects, what I liked about the campaign. The most important aspect I want to highlight from this campaign is its non-linear characteristic. And I think that this time they've done it right. They have designed a campaign with non-linear characteristics that actually works. For me, they've taken everything that didn't work in the Scarlet Keys and they've managed to make it work. In particular, they've managed to make the scenarios, which still can be played in any order, mostly, to feel very well integrated into the story, instead of feeling like several unconnected side stories, which for me is what happened in the Scarlet Keys. Here in Hemlock Vale, the scenarios feel a part of something bigger. They've managed to tell a coherent story, to tell it well, and really allow the players to immerse themselves into the story, as many of the old campaigns did. Only because of this, for me, this campaign deserves a lot of recognition. Secondly, let's remember that this campaign was the first of the new lead designers, and far from being conservative, they've proposed a quite ambitious campaign. They've done pretty bold things with the game, and to my surprise, they've implemented them way better than I expected. In particular, they've not only proposed new ideas as their successful non-linear approach, they've taken several failed mechanics and characteristics from old scenarios, they've refreshed them and actually made them work. In particular, I think that the final scenario is based on a very bold promise, and it's implemented very well in my opinion. Then I want to highlight the way the campaign manages to communicate its theme. It's one of the most immersive campaigns I've played. In particular, the way it uses its mechanics and dynamics to draw you into the story is pretty well done. Then we have the residents, these 8 characters you can interact with. I consider that they add a layer of strategic complexity into the campaign. This is because the campaign is designed in such a way that you can't befriend everyone. It's impossible to befriend each of these characters in a single playthrough. Thus, I consider that the residents are a good incentive to play the campaign several times. Beware that each resident has a different card and gives you something different. Each investigator will always have synergy with at least one of them. So depending on which group of investigators you have, you will want to befriend some residents or others. Only for that reason, I consider that this campaign has a good strategic depth, besides how the different scenarios make you think by creating interesting situations to solve. I also want to highlight the way day and night change the scenarios. For me, they managed to make each scenario unique without feeling too complex. In particular, you will have encounter sets that you will have to face in different scenarios, most of the time in different day and night conditions. So you may think that you already know a certain encounter card, but if you happen to find it in a different day or night condition, its behavior can radically change. And finally, I want to highlight how for the first time in many years, this campaign has actually used the horror elements in an interesting way. Since many campaigns ago, I think that the horror elements were progressively disappearing in this game. I mean that I don't recall feeling nerves or anxiety from the theme and game dynamics. I think that since original Carcosa, I hadn't played a campaign that actually managed to creep me out with its theme, and here they managed to get those long-gone emotions from me. The theme is quite darker and obscure than what it seems, so this is something I wanted to praise. With this, I've covered the aspects that I liked from this campaign, so let's move into the negative aspects, those things I didn't really like from this campaign. To start, although I insist that this campaign's narrative is quite good in my opinion, narrative texts are still way too long for my taste. They are not as large as in previous campaigns, but you still have to spend a lot of time reading. In particular, this campaign has a system, the Codex system, which asks you to read small blocks of text during gameplay as the in-smooth flashbacks. Although I have to say that these texts are way shorter than in-smooth ones. One way or another, although I know that some people are not bothered by this, for me you still have to read too much. Although it's true that the length of the narrative texts have been shortened since previous campaigns, where it was getting too crazy in my opinion. Secondly, this campaign follows the trend of longer scenarios. In my experience, most scenarios in this campaign take more than 2 hours to complete, sometimes closer to 3 hours. Although blind playthroughs tend to be longer as you have to read more and understand the new rules, I think the game would have benefited from shorter scenarios, more akin to what we had in Dunwich and Carcosa, which for me were ideal lengths. Then we have to talk about the preludes. I really liked the concept and the way they are implemented, as they managed to solve the biggest problem of the Scarlet Keys, which is the lack of narrative continuity, narrative sense. Preludes allow the story to be linear, which is a must if you want a good narrative. And then, inside that linearity, you can make decisions that shape the story, including the order of the scenarios. However, in particular in the case of playable preludes, they can end up prolonging game sessions a bit too much. We're talking of about 15 minutes of prelude before each scenario, and this adds to the previous point. Game sessions can become a bit too long. My advice is that the host, the person that organizes the game, prepares each playable prelude before each game session, as this can help to shorten the setup time. Beware that the prelude is where most of the story develops, and whatever happens in the prelude can make you change your mind about which scenario to play in this session. The next topic I want to address is the maps. In this campaign, most of the maps are patterns of rows and columns. Instead of using the traditional connection symbols, the maps are always rows and columns of location cards, and you move in vertical or in horizontal. This, for me, is a double-edged sword. On the one hand, the maps are always semi-random. This is, locations always have the same unrevealed side, and then on the revealed side can have anything. This creates the effect of the Dunwich train. You can never predict what you're going to encounter in the next location, even if you've played the scenario many times. But then, on the other hand, the map usually ends up occupying a lot of table space. This is a bigger problem when the campaign has several treacheries that are attached to locations and enemies that spawn in other locations. For this reason, table space can be an issue in this campaign. In particular, I have recorded my blind playthrough for my Spanish channel, and I've had to change the camera angle several times because the map and the other cards didn't fit into the image. So make sure that you have a big table for this campaign and try to be as neat and organized as possible. I also want to highlight that a couple scenarios can be a bit too random for my taste, although this is quite a subjective perception. I have a low tolerance for randomness in board games, and this campaign has one or two scenarios that go too far for my taste. However, I acknowledge that in this case, this randomness is not a design error, which happened in a few scenarios in the past. This campaign has scenarios with increased randomness in order to transmit the theme to the players. It became very clear in the scenario that I played on the first night. Anyway, I had a couple issues with one or two scenarios in this aspect, but I will have to play the campaign more times to actually address this topic more objectively. Finally, I have to highlight how the finale was exaggeratedly long. Although I have to insist on how I loved what they did in that scenario, its length was too much for my liking, as I ended my blind playthrough mentally exhausted. However, beware that I play solo 300, and this takes a lot of mental effort by definition. But I can't recall any other campaign finale that left me so exhausted. In my opinion, the second act is superfluous, doesn't really add anything. The first and the third were great, but the second only managed to prolong the game unnecessarily, in my opinion. This concludes my analysis of my blind playthrough of this campaign. So to conclude the video, I'll give you my final overall thoughts about Hemlock Vale. I think that my impressions can be summed up in this first sentence. Despite a couple nuisances that impede me from labeling this campaign as a masterpiece, without any doubts, it's been one of my best experiences in this game. At least it's been one of the best blind playthroughs I've had in a long time. Besides being the first campaign of the new lead designers, I have to say that they've exceeded my expectations by far. For me, they've done an outstanding job in terms of campaign design. Overall, the most important thing I want to remark in this video is how they've proven that non-linear elements can fit well within this game, of course, if they are designed properly. After the bad experience I had with the Scarlet Keys campaign, I wasn't fond of this campaign after knowing that it was another non-linear campaign. However, this time they've managed to make it work, mainly for two reasons. First, the number of scenario permutations is way lower this time, and this makes it easier to calibrate them to be played in different contexts. And secondly, because they've created a linear story through the preludes, and this is key to tell a story properly. In conclusion, I think that this was the best designed and implemented campaign since the days of Carcosa and the Forgotten Age, which are my two favorite campaigns. Only these small details highlighting how tediously long the finale is, I had to lower my score a little bit. If it wasn't for these small things, this could have perfectly been my new favorite campaign, as both the narrative and the scenarios are excellent in my opinion. And maybe, if you house rule a couple things, it still can be the best thing I've ever seen in this game. However, don't forget that this video is only my first thoughts after my blind playthrough. This is not a review or analysis of the campaign. In order for me to do an actual review and actually name it like that, I have to know the campaign very well, so I need several playthroughs to really grasp it. This is why this video is titled First Thoughts of the Campaign. All I can say is that my first impressions of the campaign have been unexpectedly positive. I took the campaign a bit reluctantly, but I started to enjoy it a lot after only a couple scenarios. This is a campaign filled with good things, both in theme and gameplay, but with a couple small annoying things, to the point that I can't say that this blind playthrough was the best I've ever had. Carcosa and The Forgotten Age were a bit better. This one is on par with Edge of the Earth, and I think that Hemlock Vale has a much higher ceiling than Edge of the Earth. So this concludes this video about my first thoughts after my blind playthrough of the Feast of Hemlock Vale. Thanks for watching, until we meet again here at the Arkham Seeker.